Hello, my name is Carol Adams, and I'm a volunteer with the Reading Railroad Heritage Museum. I'm glad to be with you today via Zoom to share information about the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad during the Civil War. We are colleagues in the work of preserving and teaching history. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about us. The Reading Railroad Heritage Museum is the educational center for the Reading Company Technical and Historical Society. We abbreviate that name as RCT&HS. The RCT&HS began at the end of the Reading Railroad in 1976 and is a nonprofit 501c3 all-volunteer organization. The RCT&HS has collected over 70 pieces of historic Reading Railroad locomotives, passenger and freight cars, a large archive of photos, maps, and records, and a significant artifact collection. There are over 900 members from across the United States and overseas. The Reading Railroad Heritage Museum is located in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, near the intersection of Route I-78 and Pennsylvania Route 61, 87 miles from your meeting tonight in New Jersey. The museum is open on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. As you know, the Reading Railroad was a significant influence in the industrial development of Eastern Pennsylvania and beyond, as it brought coal from the mines to the towns and industries of the area. It extended 1,300 miles at its peak, but its importance far exceeded its size. The RCT&HS seeks to preserve its history so that succeeding generations understand the traces it left behind, the towns, the rails, the landscapes. The museum occupies a 7-acre site, formerly Pennsylvania Steel Foundry. This building has been repurposed to display exhibits and for the museum store. The rolling stock collection is displayed behind the exhibit building. Tours are led by knowledgeable guides, and visitors can admire these two locomotives, which were among the last purchased by the Reading Railroad. They wear the distinctive yellow and green colors that were used by the Reading in its last years. This mural is 16 feet high and about 60 feet long, located on the north side of the exhibit building. It depicts 4 of the iconic locomotives of the Reading Railroad. And our newest addition to our site is the Railcar Protection Building, 70 feet by 150. Our rolling stock collection has been open to the weather, and after track is completed into the building, some of our most vulnerable pieces can be protected. Inside, visitors can view 5 sizes of model trains. This is our HO gauge railroad, reminiscent of the Reading's territory during the 1950s. One section of the exhibit area changes regularly. The current exhibit is The Unseen Engineers of the Reading, featuring over 30 reproductions of maps and drawings produced by the surveyors, architects, and drafters employed in the engineering department of the Reading. These documents are from the archives collection. One of them is this map, drawn in 1867, showing the Schuylkill River and the mountains of the Hamburg area. It's amazing to realize that this was produced without the assistance of modern transit levels, satellites, or GPS. The exhibit also displays artifacts and photos and other things from our collection. This one shows the architectural drawing, model, and photo of Falls Bridge in Philadelphia. This exhibit will continue through January 15, 2021. Beginning Thanksgiving weekend, our exhibit of nostalgic Christmas trains will also be shown, featuring model trains of several sizes in a holiday setting. We call this our parade locomotive, a simulated camelback locomotive on rubber tires that travels around the area, appearing at events and parades to advertise the museum. All the volunteers hope that you'll be able to visit soon on Saturdays, 10 to 4. The museum will close for the winter after January 15, reopening March 1, 2022. We look forward to welcoming you. And now, pulling for the Union. This presentation is from an exhibit that was displayed several years ago, but Obviously, the history is still valid. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad was begun in 1833. It was the predecessor to the railroad more familiar to us, the Reading Railroad or the Reading Company. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad as the P&R. Perhaps the most important factor affecting the outcome of the Civil War was the North's overwhelming industrial superiority over the South. In fact, the states of Pennsylvania and New York each had more industrial establishments than all of the Confederate states combined. The fuel for the North's industry was coal, which in the Civil War years was predominantly anthracite coal. Furthermore, the most important raw material for Northern industries was pig iron, the majority of which in the 1860s was produced in furnaces fueled by anthracite. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad was by far the largest hauler of anthracite coal and also served the nation's highest concentration of anthracite-fueled pig iron furnaces. In 1860, coal, iron ore, pig iron, and other iron products accounted for 90% of the tonnage hauled by the P&R's freight trains. Thus, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad was at the very core of the North's industrial might. The main source of the P&R's traffic and wealth was the anthracite coal mining territory of Pennsylvania. The Shenandoah City Colliery, pictured here in the 1880s, was typical of the anthracite mines served by the P&R. Moncure Robinson was one of America's leading civil engineers of the antebellum period. He was also an early advocate of railroads over canals and directed construction of several of the earliest railroads in the country. During 1834 to 1840, he served as chief engineer of the new P&R Railroad and directed construction of the line. The 93-mile railroad, built from the major anthracite coal fields of Pottsville to Reading and then to the port at Philadelphia, was the first double-track main line in the United States. It included 3 of the 9 first railroad tunnels in the United States and was reportedly the first to use crushed stone as ballast. The Reading was the first main line designed at the outset with double tracks in mind. Because of the extensive coal fields it tapped, the Reading would become one of the most profitable railroads in the US. It was also considered Moncure Robinson's first mountain railroad without inclines. The Reading paralleled the Schuylkill River Navigation Canal, and by the 1840s proved the superiority of the railroad over the turnpikes and canals as the inland transportation system of the 19th century. The spectacular stone Falls Bridge in Philadelphia was considered one of Moncure Robinson's crowning achievements. It represented the high engineering standards to which the railroad was built and was an example of the highly developed industrial might of the North. Many factories located on the P&R produced weapons and supplies for the Union Army. One was the Phoenix Iron Works of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, shown here as it appeared during the Civil War. It produced the 3-inch ordnance rifle. Designed by John Griffin, this became the most widely used rifled cannon in the Union field artillery batteries. Made of wrought iron and grooved on the inside, the 3-inch rifle was extremely durable and very accurate when used against targets at long range. About 1,000 of the 3-inch gun tubes were manufactured at Phoenixville and shipped out by either the P&R or by canal boat. Rufus Wilder was the longtime chief engineer and superintendent of the Mine Hill and Schuylkill Haven Railroad, which the P&R took over in 1864. At the start of the Civil War and well before the P&R takeover, Wilder designed an armored gun car, shown here, and the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia built it. The car was reportedly used to defend railroad workers repairing damage from Confederate cavalry raids near Baltimore and Washington. Its subsequent fate is unknown. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad supported the war in several ways. First, the P&R hauled large volumes of supplies and troops. The most significant was the large tonnage of anthracite coal for the US Navy. The coal was shipped via the Reading's main line to Port Richmond, where it was dumped into vessels for further movement to the war zones. Port Richmond's coal piers are pictured here. Another important line was the Reading's Lebanon Valley branch between Reading and Harrisburg. It formed a critical link in the rail route from important manufacturing centers in New Jersey, New York, and New England to points in the South and West. Harrisburg was an important distribution point for sending supplies to the front and was also the site of several training camps, including Camp Curtin, pictured here. That's Camp Curtin, C-U-R-T-I-N. It was the largest federal camp during the Civil War. Named in honor of Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, it officially opened April 18, 1861, and more than 300,000 soldiers passed through it before it closed on November 11, 1865. In addition to Pennsylvania regiments, troops from Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Wisconsin, and the regular army used Camp Curtin. Many of these soldiers traveled via the P&R. The camp and surrounding area was also used as a supply depot, hospital, and prisoner of war camp. At the end of the war, it became a mustering out point for troops on their way home. The P&R also supported the war effort financially in a variety of ways. For both supplies and troops, the P&R allowed the government to pay its shipping bills using government bonds rather than actual cash. The P&R offered reduced rates for troop movements, a 1/3 discount from the normal fare if the government was paying the bill, or half fare if a soldier was traveling on his own and paying his own fare. Wounded soldiers returning home and the remains of soldiers who died were carried for free. The P&R donated tens of thousands of dollars to various charitable causes in support of the troops and to the bonus pools that were paid out to encourage men to enlist. With its surplus cash, the P&R purchased war bonds issued by the government. Finally, in 1865, at a time when the US was desperately short of cash, the P&R simply deposited $2.5 million in the US Treasury, subject to withdrawal at any time. Shortly thereafter, when the P&R asked to withdraw a portion of the funds, the US Treasury couldn't oblige, as the cash had already been spent. Technically, the P&R could have forced the US into default, but instead the P&R borrowed some cash elsewhere until the government was able to return the P&R's deposit. P&R locomotives joined in the war effort. Early in the war, the P&R loaned several of its locomotives to the US Military Railroad for service in Virginia. This is the US military terminal at City Point, Virginia. Later, these locomotives, along with some other freight and passenger cars, were sold outright to the government. Locomotives are described by their wheel arrangements. A steam locomotive's wheel arrangements are grouped in the way that the number of small leading wheels, then the number of large driving wheels, and last by the number of small wheels under the cab. This picture shows the P&R steam locomotive called Pocahontas, an 080, that is no leading wheels, 8 drivers, and no trailing wheels. The locomotives sold to the government were 2 elderly 080s like this one, called the Washington and the Indiana, built by Baldwin in 1846. Also sold were the 2 newer passenger engines, the Bluebird and the Hummingbird, also built by Baldwin in 1855. The 4 locomotives were renumbered by the Army. In 1859, the PNR moved to a new Philadelphia depot at Broad and Callow Hill streets. And in 1861, leased this, their old 1839 built depot at Broad and Cherry, to the US government to use as an Army hospital. It had 525 beds, and for a while also served as administrative headquarters for other Army hospitals. After the war, the building was used as a grain warehouse and was demolished by the 1870s. Today, this site is covered by the Pennsylvania Convention Center. As the number of wounded grew, two very large military hospitals were built new in Philadelphia. They were the largest in the entire country, and one, the Maurer Hospital, was located at Windmore near Chestnut Hill on a rail line that would later become the PNR's Chestnut Hill branch. Throughout the Civil War, women formed organizations to provide supplies and support for the troops. Among the first was the Ladies' Aid Society in Reading, Pennsylvania. It was led by Mrs. Rosa Nichols, wife of the Reading Railroad's General Superintendent, G.A. Nichols. The Aid Society focused on furnishing food, clothing, and accessories to the soldiers. Sometimes Mrs. Nichols employed the services of the PNR to deliver these supplies. Sometimes she delivered them in person. As the war wore on, the total number of men in uniform from Berks County rose to over 10,000. In order to meet these expanding needs, ladies' volunteer associations were formed in other parts of the county and throughout the state. The Great Fair of the U.S. Sanitary Commission in Philadelphia, June 1864. One of the largest organizations supporting federal troops was the U.S. Sanitary Commission. In June of 1864, their Philadelphia branch held a massive fair, which raised over $1 million, a stupendous amount in those times, when the typical daily wage was $1. The PNR donated $10,000 toward the costs of staging the fair, and PNR employees donated a day's wages to the Sanitary Commission's programs. The fair was located on Logan Square, just 2 blocks south of the PNR tracks. During the Civil War, for every man killed in battle, 2 died from disease. The Sanitary Commission worked to reduce casualties by creating a nursing corps, building hospitals, and inspecting conditions in the camp. Several PNR Railroad presidents were involved in the war. John Tucker was president from 1844 to 1856, and in the 1860s was still working for the PNR as a consultant and agent for special business problems. He was regarded as a man of exceptional managerial and organizational talent. In fact, in the early days of the Civil War, it was said that Edwin M. Stanton agreed to take the job of U.S. Secretary of War only if Tucker would be his assistant. Thus, the PNR granted Tucker a leave of absence, and he became Assistant Secretary of War on January 29, 1862. 1 month later, February 27, Tucker was ordered to organize the movement of General McClellan's Army of the Potomac by boat from Washington, Alexandria, and Perryville to Fort Monroe, Virginia. On March 17, the troops began their embarkation, and by April 5th, 121,000 men, 14,000 animals, 1,100 wagons, batteries of cannon, 74 ambulances, pontoon bridges, telegraph equipment, and enormous quantities of supplies and ammunition had safely arrived at Fort Monroe. Tucker resigned his government position on June 10 of that year, but his influence and contacts proved helpful to the PNR throughout the war years. The Union fleet attacked the Confederate forts defending New Orleans. In the Civil War, Joseph Harris's surveying skills and knowledge of the southern coastline played an important role in the Union's capture of New Orleans. Then 25 years old, Harris, in command of a survey ship, came under heavy enemy fire as he charted the channel of the Mississippi River to allow Union mortar boats to accurately bombard the Confederate forts guarding the approach to New Orleans. Harris participated in other military surveys, including those leading up to the Union's capture of Mobile, Alabama. After the war, Harris got involved with the anthracite mining and railroad industries, ultimately serving as president of the PNR and the Reading Company from 1893 to 1901. In 1862, at the age of only 19, George Frederick Bear, then working as a newspaperman in Somerset, PA, helped raise a company of volunteers from Somerset County, which became Company E, 133rd Pennsylvania Volunteers. Bear was elected captain of the company. He led his company in the Battle of Fredericksburg as part of the futile charge of Humphrey's division against Mary's Heights. Bear mustered out with his regiment in May 1863, shortly after the Battle of Chancellorsville. The following year, he became a lawyer and settled in Reading. He built the Bear Building in 1870 in Reading. As his career blossomed, he became increasingly involved in the legal and business affairs of the PNR, was a close advisor to J.P. Morgan in reorganizing the bankrupt PNR, and ultimately served as president of the Reading Company and PNR from 1901 until his death in 1914. His statements on workers and labor relations became rallying cries for the unions. He wrote, "The rights and interests of the laboring man will be protected and cared for, not by the labor agitators, but by the Christian men of property to whom God has given control of the property rights." Excuse me. His attitude toward the workers is also reflected in this statement. "These men don't suffer. Why, half of them don't even speak English." Of course, the workers were offended. In contrast to Harris and Bear, another future president of the PNR, Franklin B. Gowan, avoided military service. During the Civil War years, Gowan was a successful young lawyer in Pottsville, married with 3 children. When Gowan's draft number came up in 1864, he paid a substitute to go to war in his place, which was perfectly legal at the time. The payment might have been $1,000 or more, which was equal to about 2 or 3 years' earnings for most working men at the time. During the war, Gowan's legal work got him noticed by the PNR's management, and in 1869, at the age of 33, he became PNR's president. Henry Algernon DuPont, of the prominent DuPont family of Delaware, graduated first in his class at West Point in 1861 and served as a light artillery officer during the Civil War. He reached the rank of lieutenant colonel at the age of 26. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his performance at the Battle of Cedar Creek in the Shenandoah Valley. Later, Colonel DuPont became president and a prime financial backer of the Wilmington and Northern Railroad. The family built a private station at Winterthur, their residence along the Wilmington and Northern Railroad. The station remains. He became a Reading Company director in 1892 and sold his controlling interest in the W&N to the Reading in 1898. He was also a US Senator from 1906 to 1917. His country estate was developed by his son into today's Winter Tour Museum. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad influenced the Gettysburg Campaign. In June 1863, after 2 years of battles, mostly fought on Virginia soil, Confederate General Robert E. Lee embarked on a new strategy of taking the war to the north by invading Pennsylvania, with the goals of gathering supplies and breaking the Union's will to continue the war. This map shows the movements of the Confederate Army with the red lines and the Union Army blue lines during the Gettysburg Campaign. A recruiting poster for Pennsylvania militia during the 1863 Confederate invasion. The Enlistment Center, 10th and Noble Armory, cited on the poster, was adjacent to the PNR's tracks in Philadelphia. The approaching Confederates caused substantial alarm in Pennsylvania, and the governor issued a call for 50,000 men to join the militias to defend the state. Anthracite coal mining in PNR territory was suspended, and the miners were encouraged to enlist, as it was feared one of General Lee's goals was to lay waste to the mining regions. Other industries also suspended operations so their workers could join the militias. One unit, Company F, 26th Regiment, Pennsylvania Emergency Militia, was staffed partly with PNR employees from the Pottstown area. Its captain was George Rice, a PNR civil engineer and later chief engineer of the PNR. Like other businesses, the PNR took additional precautionary steps. Important documents from the PNR headquarters in Philadelphia were packed in a trunk and shipped to Boston for safekeeping. As much as possible, rolling stock, supplies, and tools from PNR facilities in Harrisburg and other Western points were sent east. The PNR also kept a train on standby at Harrisburg to evacuate important state government documents and officials if needed. The PNR offered its 21-mile-long Chester Valley branch in Chester and Montgomery counties to the Pennsylvania Railroad for storage of PRR equipment that was likewise being evacuated from Harrisburg. This telegram was sent from the PNR's president to his general superintendent, warning of the Confederate advance. It says, from G.A. Nichols, Esquire, I have a dispatch from the governor saying the rebels are at Hagerstown. You had better not send any more cars westbound until you see what is about to happen. You will not have to wait long, I think. Signed, C.E. Smith, June 15. Here the militia digs entrenchments to protect Harrisburg. Skirmishes in late June on the west shore of the Susquehanna at Carlisle, Camp Hill, and Fort Couch opposite Harrisburg, and at Wrightsville opposite Columbia, represented the northernmost points of the Confederate advance. The Confederate Army then consolidated at Gettysburg to fight the Union Army on July 1, 2, and 3, 1863, regarded as the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. The Union won, the Confederates retreated to Virginia, and the invasion of Pennsylvania was over. Inevitably, strife accompanied the post-war growth. The original PNR main line did not directly serve any mines in the coal regions. Instead, a network of independent feeder lines hauled the coal from the mines to the railroad. The PNR used some of its profits from the Civil War traffic boom to lease or buy these feeder lines and incorporate them into the PNR system, thus protecting their traffic base of coal. Some of the P&R's wartime profits were spent on building new rail lines to further expand the P&R system. The longest of these new lines was the Reading and Columbia branch. That would be the red line that you see here. For many years prior to the Civil War, the P&R's head of its locomotive shops, James Milholland, had been experimenting with improving the design and efficiency of steam locomotives. His efforts, combined with the need for more locomotives to haul the Civil War traffic boom, culminated in his famous gunboat design. It was the most efficient anthracite-burning freight locomotive any railroad had yet built. Also known as Milholland's, they were one of the first standardized locomotive designs to be built in large quantities for US railroads. Many of the gunboats built during the Civil War years were named for Union battle victories or Union generals. This loco, named the Nashville, was built in 1865. With the wartime traffic boom producing big profits, in 1864, the P&R's common stock reached the highest price it would ever attain, over $82 per share. Unfortunately, many years after the war, bad decisions by management caused 3 periods of bankruptcy, and the value of this P&R stock was totally wiped out by 1896. The P&R's booming wartime profits led some of its workers to demand a share of the pie. On July 1, 1864, the P&R's engineers, firemen, and brakemen went on strike, crippling the movement of anthracite coal for the military. A force of about 160 railroad operating personnel from the US military railroads was sent north from Virginia to Pennsylvania to break the strike. To further enforce its position, the US government seized the P&R Railroad as a military necessity and placed it under martial law. The arrival of the military railroaders and the threat of courts-martial for mutiny quickly ended the strike. The P&R men returned to work by July 16, and the government returned the P&R to private operation July 18, 1864. Thus did the P&R become the only Northern railroad to be seized by the government during the war. This is the letter from Major General Cadwalader seizing the P&R in 1864. Labor strife also extended into the P&R's coal mining regions. Even before the war, this territory had been afflicted with crime and violence arising from the harsh living and working conditions, friction between different immigrant ethnic groups, and a general weakness of law and order. The war brought increased pressures from inflation, demands for coal production, and resistance to the draft. Strikes, riots, and murders of mine bosses and coal miners became alarmingly frequent, with some of the mayhem attributed to a secret society called the Molly Maguires. Some viewed the Mollies as defenders of the oppressed coal miners, while others considered them terrorists. The capture, trial, and hanging of the alleged leaders of the Mollies occurred in the mid-1870s, a decade after the end of the Civil War. This print shows working coal miners being harassed by strikers at Mahanoy City. The Civil War ended in 1865. With the end of the war in sight, the War Department established a discharge camp on the P&R main line at Spring Mill, Pennsylvania, near Conshohocken. The P&R built a siding and a station at Spring Mill and assigned an agent. 10 boxcars were fitted with bench seats for shuttling soldiers between the camp and Philadelphia, and the station was made a flag stop for the regular P&R passenger trains. The camp opened in November 1864 and closed in July 1865. The camp handled the nursing and mustering out of wounded and sick soldiers from Pennsylvania, plus other soldiers who for various reasons had become separated from their units. Many who passed through were former prisoners of war, especially from the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia. After the war, the site of Camp Discharge became a private estate of the same name. When its employees enlisted in the Army, the P&R promised to have jobs for them when they returned. Even for the men disabled from war wounds, the P&R tried its best to find jobs for them in stations and offices if they had enough education, or more often as watchmen for crossings, bridges, and other structures. Some were reemployed in the new network of signaling towers, which the P&R began erecting along its main line in the latter years of the Civil War to more safely control the movement of trains. These towers were nicknamed windmill towers, as the signal boards above their roofs reminded folks of windmill vanes. In 1891, the P&R expanded its railroad system to Gettysburg by taking control of the 1884 built Gettysburg and Harrisburg Railroad. The P&R began promoting Gettysburg as a tourism destination and brought in hundreds of thousands of visitors over the years, many on special excursion trains. This is a P&R Gettysburg travel guide of 1896. The grandest excursions of all to Gettysburg came in 1913, on the 50th anniversary of the battle. An encampment and reunion was held for Civil War veterans from both the North and the South. Of the estimated 100,000 visitors for the three-day event, about 70% of them traveled via the P&R's Gettysburg branch. On the busiest day, 66 special trains arrived at Gettysburg. To handle this heavy load of extra trains, the P&R installed a temporary signal system on 25 miles of the branch, then dismantled the signals after the reunion was over. This is the veterans' encampment at Gettysburg in 1913. Early that year, water wells were drilled for the July encampment. By June, hotels in the region were filling rapidly. For entertainment, a Gettysburg facility was built to display the Gettysburg cyclorama. The War Department's Great Camp provided tents and support facilities for the veterans. The Great Camp included these things: a great tent, 20 by 450 feet, with 13,000 chairs. The veterans' tents, quarters for 1,500 War Department soldiers, 2,100 mess personnel, 385 Camp Boy Scouts from Washington, and other camp personnel for a total of over 57,000 persons. The camp had a temporary U.S. post office, an emergency station, water fountains, and much, much more. Union and Confederate veterans shook hands across the stone wall of Pickett's charge. President Woodrow Wilson's July 4 reunion address summarized the spirit. "We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, our quarrel forgotten, except that we shall not forget the splendid valor." A 75th anniversary commemoration was held in 1938. By then, most of the visitors traveled by auto rather than by train. This is the 1938 advertising flyer. Even into modern times, after the automobile ended most passenger train service in rural areas, the Reading continued running special passenger excursion trains to Gettysburg. It was the most popular destination for the Iron Horse rambles of the early 1960s, and the last long-distance excursion train from Reading ran in May 1988 behind this ex-Reading steam locomotive, number 2100. Thank you for allowing me to speak with you. I hope that the information has inspired you to keep learning about Civil War history and about the importance of the Reading Railroad in the events of the largest war ever fought on this continent. And we hope that you'll come to visit us at the Reading Railroad Heritage Museum in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, where over 70 pieces of actual Reading Railroad locomotives and freight and passenger cars are displayed. Thank you so much.